Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Welcome back to the beginning of another series. So this one we are moving into this guy, Gilles Deleuze, Difference and Repetition. And we'll see how we go. I have no idea how long this series is going to be. If past experience has taught me anything, it's probably going to be somewhere between 15 and 20 videos, I would imagine. But we'll see how we go. I don't know. So let's just crack into it. So Difference and Repetition, it was Deleuze's doctoral dissertation. He wrote it in 1968. Superbly difficult, if I can say that, if that makes any sense at all. Such a difficult book to read. I guess as all of the books that I cover on this YouTube channel are, that's kind of the point of it. But I think undeniably this is a work of genius. It's as I was reading it, just seeing how the pieces all fit together into this really coherent, intricate whole was it's quite amazing. It's quite an amazing experience, actually, and just. I couldn't help but admire Deleuze while I was reading it, just seeing the facets, the different facets that make up this really quite a remarkable book, actually, quite a remarkable work of philosophy, I think. Just so much depth, so much insight, so much originality as well. There's a lot of if he's nothing else, he's original, I think, Deleuze, and he fully embodies his own concepts, his own notions of difference and repetition, and I think that'll become clear as the video goes on, as we move through the book. And I almost didn't read this because the first book of his I read was Anti-Oedipus. And man, I did not like that. Did not like it at all. I took away almost nothing from it after. I've only read it once, but man, what a difficult and really kind of a convoluted and strange book. I couldn't. It was like he was just talking right past me. I just couldn't latch on to anything solid, and the things that I did latch onto, I didn't agree with. The whole thing just was by the time I got to the end, I was virtually skimming pages just to get the thing over with. It was it was such a bad experience, actually, almost traumatic. And then so I almost didn't read this Difference and Repetition, but luckily I did. And so this video is the result of that. One thing I would say about Difference and Repetition before we start, just as a kind of a general point, is I think there are two kind of strong influences, I think, that I see in this. The first is Nietzsche. So it's very Nietzschean in tone. It's quite a passionate, I think, maybe a passionate kind of call to the reader. He's expounding a very active kind of an emphasis on living and passion and excitement. There's a thrill, a kind of unpredictability as well that features in Difference and Repetition, and it's all very Nietzschean. It's very almost chaotic. Chaos is almost at the core of the book, so it's a very, very Nietzschean in tone, but at the same time I would say very Bergsonian in structure. The core kind of foundation, I think, of Difference and Repetition is Bergsonian all the way. And you see that it comes up in various guises here and there, in some places more overtly than in others, but I think underneath underneath the ideas. It's novel for sure, original for sure, but I think an extension of Bergson would be the way I would put it, I think. So Nietzschean in tone, Bergsonian in structure is kind of how I would describe this book. Anyway, this video we are going to look at the introduction, and I've broken it down into 3 parts. I fear this is going to be a really long video, so I was kind of dreading starting, but we're here now, so let's see how we go. The first part of the video is generality. So the criterion of the general is exchangeability. And what Deleuze means by this is that when we're talking about the general, we've got things that kind of can be replaced with other things. So it's a very, I guess, it's in the word the general, it's in the word generality, right? It's not a focus on individuals. We're looking to describe individuals under an umbrella of sameness. We're looking to find things that individuals, different individuals, have in common. What unites them, what links them, what kind of concepts or ways can we think about individual separate objects which let us bring them together, group them into similar categories. So the criterion of the general is exchangeability, this exchangeability of terms. One term can be exchanged for another when we're dealing at the level of the general. And there are 2 major orders to this. The first is the qualitative order of resemblances. So this is basically just qualities. You can have exchangeability. You can see the general being characterized through qualities which are the same. We can reduce an object, an individual object, to its qualities, which lets us compare it with other individuals that have the same qualities, lets us exchange. We can exchange these separate, different individuals if they have the same qualities. They can perform the same function, if you like, in whatever context. And the other major order is the quantitative order of equivalences. Basically just quantitative, objective, reducing things to their fundamental samenesses, their fundamental identity, what it is, reducing things to what makes them, what unites them, what links them together in a quantitative sense. So those are the 2 major orders of the general. And he says that generality is exemplified by the language of science, which is obviously math. And this exemplifies generality by the way that it is dominated by the symbol of equality, in which each term may be replaced by others. So that's obviously the mathematical equation. It's the whole purpose of this is to reduce things to a kind of a lowest common denominator, where we can switch things out and move terms around and concepts. We can exchange them kind of freely within different relations, within different contexts. And so that really embodies this idea of the general. There are 3 categories that Deleuze talks about in terms of generality. The first is the order of laws. So anything governed by laws operates in the realm of generality. Far from grounding repetition, law shows rather how repetition would remain impossible for pure subjects of law, particulars. It condemns them to change. A law compels its subjects to illustrate it only at the cost of their own change. So repetition is impossible under laws because the particular subjects are subsumed under something greater than them, something abstract or general. And basically the idea here is there's no focus on the individual. We lose that concern with the individual's volition, with the individual's intention. All of that disappears when you have when individual things are governed by laws. Then there's no, and for genuine repetition, and we'll see this a little bit later, Deleuze requires that. There needs to be kind of agency here. The repetition must come about through something other than the imposition of an external law. Just kind of either blindly following a law, or because there's no kind of subject behind it, there's no agency, then it's impossible for repetition in the Deleuzian sense to play out in such a situation. And so this already suggests that, or it hints at the way that repetition for Deleuze is something different from what we normally think. We normally think of repetition as just the same thing happening again, reproduction. That's not going to be how Deleuze understands repetition. We can maybe call it authentic repetition. Deleuze doesn't call it that. He has a different word actually, and we'll come to that later. But already at this point we can see that repetition for Deleuze is not what we normally think of repetition. He's expanding the concept. So anyway, with these order of law, this order of laws, we can see then that natural phenomena fall under this category. So natural phenomena are general. He says the natural world is one where everything reacts on everything else, and everything resembles everything else, and everything's entirely subsumed under laws of nature. So there's a sense in which the natural world kind of passes over the individuals. It doesn't care about the individuals. It's just in the natural world, everything can react on everything else. Everything resembles everything else in some way, and it's all encompassed, governed by laws. And he talks about experimentation, though, which appears to reveal repetition. There appears to be repetition in experimentation, but all this consists in, he says, is substituting one order of generality for another, an order of equality for an order of resemblance. And his example is the movement of bodies in a vacuum, in which the bodies are reduced to, i.e. defined by, a small number of factors. For example, space and time. So if you have two bodies, you think of two bodies moving. They're two individual things, two particulars, but for the purposes of nature, as far as nature's concerned, they are essentially just numbers, right? They can be reduced to Cartesian coordinates, for example, identifying the location of each. And then from that, and then a few other numbers, perhaps the velocity of those, the way that they're moving, the time in which they are at certain points, just a few points, a few data points serve to describe these moving bodies. But describing them in those terms reduces them to the same kind of thing. It reduces them to the same form. They now have the same form, so that we can ignore the differences. We can ignore them as individuals in their own right, as individual, whatever they might be, asteroids or comets or planets or whatever. We can ignore them as separate singularities in their own right, and just treat them as instances of the same thing, as instances of Cartesian coordinates, for example. And so in this way, it just kind of the law, the order of laws, just brushes over everything and reduces it to to the same. It imposes the same form on everything, so that then that's just the way that nature works. There is no accounting for or respect of or acknowledgement of individuals as individuals. They have no meaning beyond their meaning within this system of laws, the laws of nature. And so the resemblance of nature that we talked about, where everything resembles everything else, the resemblance of nature in this case is replaced by the equality of forms. The form becomes the same for both. And this is all that's important. This is all that is relevant for and within nature. Okay, so that's the first category, the order of laws. The second category is conduct, and this is the moral law. So the general here is habit, or more precisely the form of habit, i.e. habit as a second nature. That is to say, conduct, again, subsumed under a law, governed by a rule. And the emphasis, the important point here is on the word second and second nature. Habit which has become second nature, so that there is no longer any original intention, any original thought that goes into the behavior here, the conduct. And to that extent, to the extent that the conduct has become second nature, is no longer thought about anew and in each separate context, to that extent it becomes part of the general. It becomes one of this category of the general moral law. So the form of habit never, Deleuze says, gives rise to true repetition. Sometimes the action changes and is perfected while the intention remains constant. Sometimes the opposite. The action remains the same in different contexts and with different intentions. But in either case, whether the action changes or the context or the intention changes, habit is governed by and subsumed under law. So again, no authentic reaction to any given situation. And it's that means repetition in the Deleuzian sense is impossible here. Instead, all you have is this kind of mechanical reproduction, following of a rule, the enacting of a law. And that is exactly what Deleuze means by the general. The third category is that of concepts or representation. And here the relation of a concept to its object is what Deleuze means by representation. And basically the idea here is this, it's abstract, this kind of focus on the concept rather than an actual lived engagement with reality. So and this is something which this is the main nemesis in the book, really. He talks about and against conceptuality and representation all the time, because it takes away that authentic engagement, right? It divorces us, it detaches us from an actual concrete discussion, from anything regarding actual concrete existence, which I fully agree with and I wholeheartedly endorse. And just to veer off topic a little bit, I've been reading a little bit of speculative realism recently. I read a couple of philosophers you probably are not familiar with, Tristan Garcia and Marcus Gabriel, who are both speculative realists, and they, very, especially Gabriel, really abstract kind of, I call it like semantic wrangling is how I would describe it. These subtle, hair-splitting kind of logical arguments. His book is just full of them, and it's boring to read, to be honest. It's dry, and I don't want to read it, because at the end of the day, all I've got afterwards is playing with concepts. All he's done is jiggling concepts around. So much so that he's no longer describing reality anymore, which is like, what's the point then? What's the point of your philosophy if all you're doing is constructing this conceptual edifice that bears no concept, that bears no relation to reality, to concrete existence? Fully on board with this idea. And it's kind of one of my main nemesis as well. So where was I? What was I talking about? Concepts and representation. Okay, it's abstract, and this is a perfect. It's the third category of the general. However, he says that Deleuze says concepts can be blocked, and there are two kinds of blockages: artificial blockage and a natural blockage. We'll deal with the natural blockage when we come to repetition in the next section, but here with regards to the general and concepts, this third category, the blockage that concerns us is artificial blockage, and it's difficult to see what Deleuze means by the word blockage, actually. But what I take away from this is that if you've got concepts, you can use those concepts to kind of facilitate an understanding and move through a situation, or move through a description of something. But those concepts can, if they can become blocked, then they kind of prevent the continuing flow, if you like, of whatever it is, the process or the explanation or the description. And then when they become blocked, that concept repeats again and again. That's kind of how I see it. That's kind of how I understand this idea of blockage. So you get repetition of concepts through blockages. But this repetition, artificial blockage, this repetition which comes from artificial blockage, is a bad repetition, if you like. Or even we could say it's repetition. It appears to be repetition, but it isn't true repetition for Deleuze. And I'll explain that when we come to repetition in the next section. But anyway, you've got these concepts. So we've got concepts, the third category of generality. They can be blocked, and therefore they appear to repeat. Well, they repeat, but in a kind of negative sense. And that is captured by this word artificial blockage, which is logic pure and simple. And here he's talking about the way that concepts can be artificially blocked when predicates remain fixed in the concept while becoming something else in the thing. And his example is animal, the concept animal, which becomes something different in horse or person. So each determination as horse or person remains then general. It defines a mere resemblance rather than capturing an essence of individuality. Rather than talking about the horse has kind of been reduced to this concept of animal. which applies not just to horse, but to a whole range of other individuals. So each determination of the concept remains fixed in that concept, and in that sense, the concept is blocked within our understanding. Every individual determination we make is blocked by this concept. It's stuck on this concept, which reduces all of the individuals to the level of mere resemblance, to an instantiation of some kind of identical thing, concept, in this case, animal. Furthermore, the concept is applicable to an infinity of things. Therefore, the concept itself can never actually exist. The concept never comes about. And this is important for Deleuze because, like I said before, the concrete, actual existence is what he is concerned with here. And the concept in this way, as abstract, as kind of restricted to thought, to cognition, can never exist. It has no existence outside of this kind of conceptual abstract realm, and that will be a problem. So in general, the category of the general, I think all of these three categories, use that word, I've overused that word, haven't I? These three categories of the general can be encapsulated, I think, by saying that they each lack engagement with reality. So there's no actual existence, and they are characterized by this dismissal of the individual, which Deleuze will call the singular, or singularities, when we come to repetition, which is where we're going now, and that's the second part of the video, repetition. All right, so repetition, and this is in contrast to generality. So repetition concerns non-exchangeable and non-substitutable singularities. Contrast that with what we said about the general, which the criterion for the general was exchangeability. So repetition is the exact opposite. It deals with the non-exchangeable and the non-substitutable. The focus being on the singulars, the singular, the individual, the particular. So repetition always reveals a singularity as opposed to particulars subsumed under laws. And his examples for this are very confusing, I think, if you're reading it for the first time. And I remember when I read this for the first time, I was like, what on earth are these examples? But I think after you've read the whole book and you kind of come back to it, you can kind of make sense of this. Anyway, I'll give them to you. The examples he gives are reflections, echoes, doubles, by which I presume he means doppelgangers, festivals, and souls of all things. But the idea is that in each of those, the repeated instance is first and foremost a singularity, is first and foremost an individual in itself, not just the repetition of something the same. So a reflection, for example, although it is a kind of a reproduction of something, an original copy, if you like, it is something in and of itself, something more than just another copy, just a reproduction. Echo, the same with an echo. The echo is not the same. It bears resemblances, but its essence, if you like, its characteristic feature is different from the original that it repeats. Same with doubles, doppelgangers, and you can kind of see what Deleuze is getting at with the rest of these as well, festivals and souls. Of course, he's not staking any kind of metaphysical claim here. He's not making any kind of metaphysical claim or mystical claim about souls. This should just be taken as illustrating what he means by repetition. So, to repeat is to behave in a certain manner, but in relation to something unique or singular which has no equal or equivalent. Not add a second and a third time to the first, but carry the first time to the nth power. So I quite like that. And it may not come across as clearly as it does after you've kind of spent some time with the book as a whole, but the more I read that passage, the more I like it. Repetition is not adding a second and a third time on top of the first. It's not a reproduction. Rather, we're carrying that first time to the nth power. And the danger with that, though, is that you think of that first time as being the same and just kind of being, that's what remains invariant through all of these repetitions. And that is definitely not what repetition's about. So you have to kind of approach that quote in the right way to get what Deleuze wants you to get from it, I think. And the only way that comes about is through repetition of what Deleuze is talking about when he talks about repetition, through just persevering and rereading and just letting the concepts kind of percolate and sink into you. But yeah, it does kind of, it's grown on me. Let me say that. It's grown on me, that quote. But the emphasis here, again, is on the singular, not the general. But like I said before, not the singular as identical in each iteration. And that's a distinction that will become clear as we go on. So whereas the general was characterized or exemplified by the language of science, repetition is exemplified in lyrical language, where every term is irreplaceable. Every term is what it is in itself, and it can't be substituted for another term. It is what it is, and therefore it can only be repeated because it has this inexchangeability about it. It can't be substituted or exchanged. And again, that sounds like there's an identity here in the thing, the term itself, but just put that thought on hold, because we'll address it later on in the video. So lyrical language represents repetition, or characterizes, embodies repetition, exemplifies repetition. And whereas we saw and this is where we get back into the concepts. So we talked about concepts under the general and the way that they can be blocked through that artificial blockage. And now in this, when we come to repetition itself, Deleuze talks about natural blockage. So concepts can be blocked in a natural way as well. And whereas with the artificial blockage, Deleuze called that logic pure and simple, natural blockage he calls transcendental logic, or a dialectic of existence. And so this is already hinting at a fairly significant difference between the two kinds of blockages. So this blockage, natural blockage, is going to reveal a true kind of repetition, or it enables true, authentic, I keep using that word, but Deleuze doesn't use it, but an authentic repetition, as opposed to that, what I call the bad repetition of artificial blockage. So with natural blockage of the concept, there are three categories here. The first, and this section actually is extremely difficult to penetrate, and it took me ages. In fact, I started filming this video last week, and then when I got to the section, realized actually I didn't understand what Deleuze is talking about, and so I had to scrap the whole thing, and I spent the rest of the day trying to unpack this section and redoing my prep. So yeah, this was a real challenge to get through. Anyway, enough about that. So the three categories of natural blockage. The first one is nominal concepts, and Deleuze calls this the discrete. And these concepts are characterized by discrete extension and finite comprehension. And so what he means, well, the example he gives here is words and the way that they come into existence in speech and writing. And it's not the example, it's what nominal concepts are. They are words which come into existence through speech and writing, and therefore the repetition here appears through language. So this, I think, is similar to what he talked about with lyrical language being that which best represents repetition. So the nominal concepts, words, forms a true repetition in existence rather than an order of resemblance in thought. Repetition here is the pure fact of a concept with finite comprehension being forced to pass as such into existence. And that's the kind of quote that I think that I anchored my understanding on here. So words, he talks about words possessing a comprehension, a finite comprehension. And the reason for this is just that they're defined by a finite number of words. So words they're bounded. Their definitions are to some extent, it's not a clear distinction, but it's not a clear boundary around the definition of each word, but there is a finitude to it. They can't be used in any situation. Any word can't be used in any situation. They are bounded by a definition. No matter how hazy their definition might be, there is still this boundary around them, and that's what Deleuze means when he says they possess a finite comprehension. And they have limited extension, so they are linguistic atoms, if you like. In fact, that's what Deleuze calls them. That is to say, they are isolated and discrete parts with no extension into other words in the sentence or the paragraph. So they form these discrete wholes. And that's why Deleuze calls this category of nominal concepts the discrete, because they are the little linguistic atoms with this finite extension, finite comprehension, limited extension. And so again, note the emphasis that Deleuze is placing here on existence as opposed to thought. So words come into existence as language through speech, through writing, and that is important for any kind of repetition to take place. It has to get outside of a pure abstract realm, a purely conceptual, logical kind of representation of reality. It has to get into reality itself. And words repeat because in coming again, if you like, and arising again in different situations, in different contexts, they're always different. So the same word in different contexts is never the same. It still has a finite comprehension. It can't represent anything, but in appearing in a different context, the same word, when it's repeated, it never carries the same meaning. It functions in a different way. in a different context, in different contexts. And I think, and that's why Deleuze sees this as repeating. It's not, although the word itself is the same, there is this key underlying difference, and that is more important than the resemblance, than the identity of the word in each case, in each repetition. So, okay, natural blockage of concepts. The first instance of this is, the first category is nominal concepts, the natural blockage of nominal concepts, the discrete words. The second category are concepts of nature. And Deleuze calls this the alienated. And we'll look at why he calls it that in a moment. But here, so with nominal concepts, we talked about them having discrete extension and finite comprehension. The concepts of nature have indefinite comprehension, all virtually infinite, Deleuze says, but not infinite. Indefinite comprehension, but it lacks, or they lack, memory. Still very hard to know what Deleuze is getting at when I explain it like this, but I think it will become clear as we go on. This is the same problem I had when reading it, by the way. You read through it and you're like, okay, so what are you talking about, Deleuze? What are you, give me something tangible I can grab here. And he doesn't really. You have to sift through and pick out the gems. But anyway, so keep going. The comprehension here is indefinite because, and this is going to sound a little bit weird as well, and kind of tough to get your teeth into. But it's indefinite because no matter how far in the concept you go, you can always repeat. And by that, Deleuze means you can always make several objects correspond to it, to the concept. Still unclear, right? Let me give you an example. The example is space. So space is the concept, and this repeats objects. But objects are not things in space. The objects are things like right and left, up and down. And you can repeat those objects indefinitely. With whatever, within the concept of space, you can always repeat those objects indefinitely in new contexts. So this is the sense in which Deleuze sees repetition within these concepts of nature, like space. Okay, maybe a little bit clearer, I think, with that last example. Space is a concept which repeats the objects of right, left, up and down, and so on and so forth. Repeats those objects indefinitely, not infinitely, because you can't repeat anything within those, but there's a finite number, if you like, of objects which can be repeated as far as you like, as far as you want to take space, as far as you want to go within the concept of space. But how is this different from nature as generality? We talked about nature before as being general, right, a part of general, and here we are talking about nature as repetition. And the difference is that nature in general referred to natural phenomena. Here we're referring to concepts of nature. And that's not to say abstract thoughts or theories, but what Deleuze has in mind here are those synthetic a priori judgments of Kant's, which structure the natural world. So they are, the concepts of nature are the a priori concepts which we use to structure our experience of the natural world. That's the key to understanding this section, I think, this little part of natural blockage. So this means principally space and time, right? Kant's pure forms of sensible intuition, but presumably other categories as well, insofar as they relate to the way that we structure the natural world, insofar as they function as these kinds of these a priori concepts of nature. So that's how it's different from nature as phenomena governed by laws. But why alienated? Why does he call this the alienated? And the reason is the concepts of nature, again, the a priori forms, Kant's a priori forms here, a priori judgments, they are not in nature, but they're in the mind which contemplates it. So the concepts of nature are alienated from nature itself because they're in us. They're what we use to order, structure, organize the natural world into some kind of meaningful, coherent phenomenon. So they're in the mind. They're in the mind which contemplates it, not in nature itself. But again, just drilling this point in, not abstract. So they're not abstract thoughts making up some kind of logical theory or anything like that, removed from reality. They're still connected to the natural as a structural or organizing framework. And so that's kind of, again, really important for Deleuze, that this repetition takes place not through any kind of abstract theoretical construct, but through an engagement with reality, with concrete existence. Okay, so that's the second category of natural blockage. The third category of natural blockage of the concept is with concepts of freedom. And here he calls these the repressed. And that's a pretty strong hint that we're dealing with psychoanalysis here. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But what are these? What's the blockage of concepts of freedom? So a particular representation, this is a particular representation with infinite comprehension, with memory. So remember, concepts of nature were indefinite comprehension without memory. Now concepts of freedom, particular representation, infinite comprehension with memory, but it lacks self-consciousness. And repetition appears here as the unconscious of the free concept of knowledge or of memory, the unconscious of representation. And so really you have to think of this in terms of like the repressed, a repressed event or something kind of occurring again, repeating in one's psychic life. You have to think of it in those terms to make sense of this, what he means. And that kind of repetition is always unconscious, right? It takes place in the unconscious. That's what makes it a repressed event that is kind of being brought back under different situations in different contexts. And that's what Deleuze means when he says it lacks self-consciousness. You're not aware of, or each repetition of that event is not aware of itself as a repetition. You're just enacting. You're just acting, unaware that you're repeating this traumatic event, which is kind of dictating or controlling your behavior or forcing it into certain channels. So that's why it's lacking self-consciousness, but it has memory, because obviously without memory there can be no repression. There can be no repetition of this, or of some kind of repressed event. So why concepts of freedom though? Why does he call this concepts of freedom? And he doesn't tell us, well, not that I can discern anyway, but presumably this is because it's concerned with human life, and which, although, like I say, Deleuze doesn't go into this, he doesn't explain this, but human life will be characterized by freedom. We're not just mechanically carrying out actions based on some kind of, cause-effect structure. We are agents, embodied agents with I don't want to say the word free will, because you get sucked into the free will determinism debate, but we are free agents. I think Deleuze you'd have to say that Deleuze holds that opinion. And so because of that, since we're talking about the life of a conscious organism, then we're dealing with something which is not just mindlessly reacting to stimuli anymore, which has some aspect, some element of freedom associated with it. And presumably this explains the infinite comprehension as well. Why is it infinite? Because the concept doesn't repeat a number of objects indefinitely anymore, like we saw with concepts of nature, but it opens up this kind of space, i.e. the particular act, event, scene, or being, in which an infinite number of possible objects can be found, can arise. So when you repeat an event, a traumatic event, say from the past, each event opens up this space. Each repetition opens up this novel space, a new context, a new situation in which you can track down any number of unique possible objects. So it's kind of limitless in its scope, if you like. And I think this category shows us nicely how blockage leads to repetition, because you can think of a psyche in which a traumatic event has taken place, and it's kind of, that event has kind of blocked one's psychic life or psychic flow, if you like that. And I'm not referring to anything mystical by that. I just mean one's psychological experience is kind of blocked. There's this boulder in the middle of the river, the stream, and it's blocking the path, and so it's creating this turbulence, which is manifesting as this repetition which takes place, causing this blockage, then causing that event, whatever it is, to recur, i.e. repeat. Nice. And just one other thing to note with that. So repression is something we normally think of as something negative, right? We think of this as something to be avoided, something to be fixed if we find it. But Deleuze is linking it with his concept of repetition, which is undoubtedly a fully positive force. It's half of the title of the book, Difference in Repetition. So it's a positive force for Deleuze, but it's coming up in connection with repression, which is something we typically think of as negative. And that's a good indication here that Deleuze is not concerned with, and it's not a self-help book. He's not trying to make you happy or anything like that, or make you live a fulfilled life or anything like that. He's just looking to describe reality, the way that reality, human reality, lived reality, flows, the way that we. And it's not just restricted to human experience either. He's trying to capture something deeper than just phenomenology. But that phenomenology comes up as part of it, obviously, as a extension of what he's talking about here. Repetition it's a force in the universe, I want to say. It's a force which underlies everything. That's what Deleuze is trying to express. He's trying to describe, and so I would describe this as metaphysical reality. The way the universe is, the way reality is, the way it works. And repetition is a core part of that. Whether it manifests as something we think is good, whether it manifests as something we think is bad, whether it manifests as something that makes us happy or that makes us frustrated and sad, is irrelevant. We're not at, we've gone below that level of kind of human psychology. So yeah, just I thought that was a nice illustration of that. The fact that even though repetition is positive, it features in something which is clearly negative, something that we don't want to encourage, and we want to overcome if we find ourselves, with repressed anxieties or with repressed memories and things. But this is linked with repetition for Deleuze. Okay, so what is the difference then between natural and artificial blockage? Let's just get a kind of an overview of this. So artificial and natural blockage, the main difference, it's in the way that Deleuze describes them. Artificial blockage is concerned with logic, pure and simple. It's abstract. Natural blockage, on the other hand, he describes as a dialectic of existence. It's concrete. It deals with concrete reality. So that, I think, is kind of the main difference between the two. And that means that the former, artificial blockage, if it repeats, if we can talk of it repeating, it repeats in a kind of an inauthentic way, if you like. Whereas natural blockage repeats in an authentic, it's true repetition for Deleuze. And natural blockages come in three varieties. And I'm just trying to, again, give a kind of an overview of what we just talked about. Natural blockages, three varieties: definite comprehension, indefinite comprehension, and infinite comprehension. And basically that's kind of the thread linking those three. So these natural blockages are all instances of true repetition, but, there's always a but. There are two things that Deleuze is concerned with here. They're true repetition, but the sameness in each is normally invoked to account for the repetition. Repetition is attributed to elements which are really distinct, but nevertheless share strictly the same concept. So when we think of these things when we identify them as repeating, we mistakenly think they're repeating because of the sameness in each iteration, the sameness linking each iteration, the sameness of concept. And that is a mistake. And the second thing, even though they're all instances of true repetition, the repetition is given as a negative explanation, and that it appears to be due to the inadequacy of the concepts involved in some way. So if we think about in that first case, nominal concepts, words, repetition appears to occur here because nominal concepts naturally possess a finite comprehension. They're limited. So that's the reason we normally think the explanation for their repetition. They must repeat. They're limited. We only have a finite number of words to use to describe certain situations, and that's why they repeat. In the second case, repetition appears to occur because concepts of nature are naturally devoid of memory. They're alienated and outside themselves. So there is, again, a repetition in the sense of a mechanical kind of automatic iteration of an original idea, an original concept. So the original is just copied again and again because there's no there's no memory. There's nothing active in these concepts of nature. We typically think, and that's what that's how we explain the repetition. We explain the repetition as due to the fact that there is no memory behind this, that there is no active agency. All there is this mechanical repetition of concepts. And in the third case, repetition appears to occur because the concept of freedom remains unconscious, while memories and representations remain repressed. Again, the repetition we think is given a negative explanation in the sense that it's unconscious. We don't deliberately intend to repeat. It just happens naturally, of its own kind of automatically, without our agency, without our actively willing it. And that's a mistake. So Deleuze wants to provide an explanation of repetition, or the repetition involved in natural blockage, which avoids invoking the sameness of the concept to account for the repetition, and which also is fully positive. So he doesn't want repetition to arise as a result of a lack, of something missing, of the concept being inadequate in some way, whether it be because it has a finite comprehension, or because it's devoid of memory, or because it's unconscious. So he wants to give a positive explanation. And to that end, Deleuze talks about the element of disguise in repetition. So repetition often appears as repetition of the same, governed by identity. That's how it usually appears. For example, the mechanical, repetitive act a person suffering from OCD performs. But underneath this, Deleuze says, is a more profound repetition which is played in another dimension, a dimension grounded in difference. And that is the key here. That's the key. There is repetition, but it's not repetition of the same thing. It's repetition of, it's a more profound repetition grounded in difference. Repetition is truly that which disguises itself in constituting itself, that which constitutes itself only by disguising itself. It is not underneath the masks, but is formed from one mask to another. And so disguise and the symbol are key elements of repetition for Deleuze. And so just keeping that in mind as we move on to this next part, repetition disguises itself. True repetition, that profound repetition, that repetition grounded in difference, disguises itself within this more superficial, external, if you like, superficial repetition, which sees merely the same. It's the sameness of concept in each iteration. And to that, so moving on from that, then we have two types of repetition. The first is static, which Deleuze calls an abstract effect, and he also calls this bare repetition, B-A-R-E, bare repetition. And this refers back to a single concept which leaves only an external difference between the ordinary instances of a figure. And so that was what I meant when I said superficial. This repetition is superficial because it only concerns itself with the outer shell, if you like, which is the same in each repetition, in each iteration. And it's also what I meant when I said earlier that concepts can repeat, concepts can repeat an artificial blockage. Concepts can repeat when they are artificially blocked, but they repeat in a bad way, I said, or it's not even, they appear to repeat. And that's what I was getting at, was this idea here, which Deleuze calls static repetition. And the other kind of repetition then is dynamic. and this Deleuze calls an acting cause, in contrast to static repetition, which was an abstract effect. And he also calls this later clothed repetition, as opposed to the static repetition, which was bare. And so this is the repetition of an internal difference, which it incorporates in each of its moments and carries from one distinctive point to another. And that's the key idea there. Repetition of an internal difference. And so what repeats is not the outward form, although that it does repeat, but that's not true repetition. That's not the driving force. That's just the superficial abstract effect. The true driver of repetition is the repetition of difference, the difference of the difference within the whatever it is, the event, the situation, the behavior. It's that the difference that thing, whatever it is, that thing embodies. Because each thing embodies, for Deleuze, difference, is characterized at its core by difference, not by identity. By that I mean identity with itself. It is fundamentally different, and it's that which repeats in each instance. So that's the profound repetition here, the repetition of the difference that each instance embodies, that each thing embodies, whether it be a behavior or an entity or a situation. If it truly repeats, then that's what's repeating. The difference that, the internal difference, which is the heart of that thing. So static repetition is only the outward appearance or the abstract effect of dynamic repetition. Dynamic repetition is the real driver here. That's what's taking place. And static repetition is just this abstract effect. It's what we read off. It's the kind of the low-hanging fruit that we grasp when we try and understand repetition. But there's a deeper, more essential truth to be had here, and that's dynamic repetition. Now he gives this example, which is again a very difficult example to penetrate, and he doesn't really explain it well, I don't think, Deleuze. But the example is the way that we acquire a motor skill. For example, swimming. So he uses swimming. I don't know if that's a reference to Bergson or not, but Bergson also talks about swimming. And he says that instead of this being a pure imitation of the teacher, i.e. characterized by representation and action, the teacher represents and we act, which is a reproduction of the same, right? Which is mere copying, mimicking. Instead of that, we learn to swim. Actual learning involves sign and response. So rather than repetition and action, the words that Deleuze uses to describe actual learning are sign and response. And the reason he uses these words is because he's trying to capture a genuine encounter with the other, rather than a kind of superficial reproduction of mechanical reproduction of the same, mimicry of something we see. So sign and response is kind of an important idea for Deleuze, and sign in particular. And he talks about signs in the way that they involve heterogeneity as opposed to homogeneity, the sameness, the identity that we can find in representation and action. So signs involve heterogeneity in three ways. And this was kind of difficult to get into, but this is my take on it anyway. In the first way, they involve difference, heterogeneity, in the object which bears them, the object which bears the signs. And I think what he means here is the teacher, him or herself, being different from the wave or the water in which we're actually swimming. So we receive a sign from the teacher, which we use to grasp the kind of fundamentals of the motor skill that we're trying to learn, swimming. But that sign that we get from the teacher is different from the sign we get from the wave, to which we have to respond as well. And so though there's difference, there's heterogeneity in the signs we receive from the different objects which bear them, the teacher as opposed to the wave. Signs also involve heterogeneity in themselves. And this is because all signs envelop another object which they incarnate or actualize. That's unfortunately not going to make much sense at this point. We talk much more about that in the second half of the book, because this object that signs envelop is actually the idea, capital I, idea. But there's no point in trying to explain that just now. Like I say, we'll deal with that when we come to the second half of the book. But the idea is that each sign is different, because the sign of each object, the teacher, the wave, envelops a different idea. It brings a different idea to actualization. So signs are different in themselves. Signs are different in the object which bears them. They're different in themselves, and they're also different in the response that they elicit. So the response, i.e. the movement of the swimmer, doesn't resemble the sign, i.e. the wave. So the wave gives me a sign to which I have to respond, but the sign which the movement, the response that I generate and the movement I generate, I make in response to that, is different from the sign that the wave gives me. And so there's another way in which signs involve heterogeneity in the responses that they elicit, which are different from the signs themselves, the signs which prompt that response. Okay, and so he kind of summarizes this little section of this example of acquisition of a motor skill by saying learning involves an innate or acquired practical familiarity with signs. There's that word again, signs. So there is no ideomotivity, only sensory motivity. That is to say, there's an intense kind of encounter going on when we learn something. When we learn, particularly when we learn a motor skill, there's a practical familiarity that you can't just reduce to concepts, to intellection, to cognition. We're going beyond that, and this is something that Bergson talks about. It's something that Merleau-Ponty talks about a lot. But yeah, we don't acquire motor skills through thinking and conceptualizing and intellecting through intellectualization, but through practical familiarity, through a natural kind of, and this is where Merleau-Ponty draws on the body as well. So we learn through, our bodies learn, not our minds. And it's our minds which follow our body. But that's drifting into Merleau-Ponty territory. Let's stay with Deleuze. Okay, so that's repetition. And the final section of today's video, we're going to look at Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. All right, so this should be quite a short section. The idea here is just that Deleuze talks about the way Kierkegaard and Nietzsche coincide with each other and with Deleuze regarding his idea of repetition. And I'll just briefly run through this. So they both, he says, make something new of repetition itself. So Kierkegaard, he says, doesn't attempt to draw something new from repetition, but he attempts to make repetition itself the novelty. So he's shifting the focus. When something repeats, we're not drawing something new from each iteration. The repetition itself, every iteration itself, is new, is novel. And the same with Nietzsche. He tries to liberate the will, not by saying that we need to do things differently, but by making repetition the object of willing. So now I will my own repetition, and that rises me, it lifts me above it, lifts me above the kind of, whereas before perhaps I was mechanically carrying it out, repeating. Now I embrace that, I will it, I desire it. And this is, I guess, connected with Nietzsche's love of fate. So that's what he's getting at with that. Secondly, they both oppose repetition to the laws of nature. Kierkegaard, he says, condemns any attempt to derive repetition from nature, contrasting his philosophy with Epicurus or the Stoics, which he calls aesthetic repetition, as opposed to a more genuine repetition, which is separate from and different from the repetition we see in nature. Obviously, the Stoics and Epicurus, but in particular the Stoics, attempted to place nature at the center of their philosophy, as something to be emulated. Kierkegaard criticizes that as mere aesthetic repetition. It doesn't get to the genuine repetition that Deleuze is talking about here. Also, Nietzsche does find repetition in nature, he says, but only because he discovers in it something superior to the reign of laws, something superior to the laws of nature. He discovers a willing itself through all change, a power as opposed to a law. And I think we can connect that back to Schopenhauer, right? Schopenhauer's notion of will there as this driving force, and that came through in Nietzsche. He distanced himself from Schopenhauer a little bit, but there was still that idea of nature as will in the Schopenhauerian sense. Nature as this force, a willing itself through change. They both also oppose repetition to the moral law. Obviously, Kierkegaard's teleological suspension of the ethical comes through here, what he talked about in Fear and Trembling, the way that Abraham's actions when he's willing to sacrifice his son, ethically that is unthinkable, but Kierkegaard says Abraham was responding to a call higher than the ethical. So again, opposing repetition to the moral law. He's also against Hegel's mediation and morality, grounded in the generality of concepts. Deleuze raises that point here. Regarding Nietzsche, obviously the movement beyond good and evil is where Nietzsche takes this, so beyond ethics. And in the same way, against Kant and Hegel's mediation and their morality grounded in concepts, again, general concepts. Also, he mentions Nietzsche's atheism and avowed opposition to all forms of law at this point. So Nietzsche was pretty adamant about that. I think we can all agree. And so that the Deleuze says ties in with his account of repetition. Fourthly, they both oppose repetition to the generalities of habit and the particularities of memory. So for Kierkegaard, repetition was the second power of consciousness, where second means not a second time, but the infinite, which belongs to a single time, the eternity, which belongs to an instant. And this is where Deleuze talks about, again, the nth power. And I'm pretty sure that Kierkegaard, what Deleuze has in mind here, Kierkegaard's connecting that with the religion. I mean, all of Kierkegaard winds up in the religion and the religious in some way or other. But Deleuze isn't following him that far. He's just pointing out that, okay, however Kierkegaard got there, he got to this idea that repetition is opposed to the generalities of habit. And the same with Nietzsche through his eternal return, which is something that's going to come up again and again in Difference and Repetition. Eternal return is the immediate expression of the will to power, where will to power does not mean to want power, but whatever you will, carry it to the nth power. And I think Deleuze takes some fairly wide liberties regarding Nietzsche's concept of the eternal return. But again, you can see how it fits in here. And we'll talk more about eternal return later. Finally, both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche emphasize movement against Hegel's false movement, i.e. against the abstract logical movement of mediation. They want to put metaphysics in motion, Deleuze says, in action. And yeah, they were both, Kierkegaard in particular was vehement against Hegel. He totally, actually, it's Schopenhauer who was vehement, who excoriated Hegel at every chance. But Kierkegaard also does set himself up as opposed to Hegel for sure. And so that's basically the introduction. There is one last quote I want to give you, which I think summarizes this passage the introduction quite nicely. It goes like this: to the extent that the internal repetition projects itself through a bare repetition which covers it, the differences that it includes appear to be so many factors which oppose repetition, which attenuate it and vary it according to general laws. Beneath the general operation of laws, however, there always remains the play of singularities. Cyclical generalities in nature are the masks of a singularity which appears through their interferences. And beneath the generalities of habit and moral life, we rediscover singular processes of learning. So I think that's a nice quote to capture what Deleuze is getting at in here, because dynamic repetition remains hidden and all we see is static repetition. We think static repetition is all there is, repetition of the same, a repetition grounded in identity and in resemblance. But static repetition isn't even repetition really in the Deleuzian sense. Instead, it's the same appearing and reappearing according to the operation of general laws. It's a superficial understanding of what's taking place. Underneath the same are the singularities which cannot be subsumed into identity or sameness because they themselves are fundamentally different. And that is nice. One last point then before I leave you. The mistake here, as Deleuze sees it, is to take difference to be conceptual difference and repetition to be an extrinsic difference between objects represented by the same concept. So he's just trying to penetrate through that, or penetrate that illusion, that mistake that we typically think when we think of repetition, and when we think of difference, we take these as conceptual. He wants to uncover the essence behind them both. And that brings us to a summary. So our first topic was generality, and this was characterized by exchangeability and exemplified by the language of science. So sameness ruled here. And we talked about, regarding the language of science, the symbol of equality and replaceable terms that define mathematical expressions. And generality was divided into three categories: laws, conduct, and concepts or representation. So the laws, we talked about essentially laws of nature. The conduct, we talked about moral law, and habit in particular, which was the vehicle through which was the vehicle by which generality was maintained. And finally, concepts of representation were abstract. They were logic-based, so very removed from reality, removed from concrete reality. And we also looked at the way that concepts can be artificially blocked. And this meant that they repeat, but statically. So always with reference to an identical concept, reference to sameness. That was what characterized this kind of blockage. Then the second part of the video, we looked at repetition, and this was characterized by non-exchangeability and exemplified in lyrical language. So non-exchangeability really captures the notion of difference, the way that difference is built into repetition. And in lyrical language, we talked about the way every term is irreplaceable. It can't be substituted with another term without losing something, without changing the passage. Then we looked at the natural blockage of concepts. So this was the twin to the artificial blockage of concepts that we talked about under generality. And natural blockage of concepts, there were three categories here. The first was nominal concepts, the second concepts of nature, and the third concepts of freedom. Nominal concepts were the discrete, so these were characterized by definite comprehension, words essentially. Concepts of nature, the alienated, so this was indefinite comprehension, and we connected this with Kant's a priori synthetic a priori judgments, the way that we represent, we organize or structure the natural world. And that was why Deleuze called these the alienated. And then concepts of freedom, which were the repressed, these characterized by infinite comprehension. And all of these repeat, but in a way which appears to refer back to an identical concept. But this was an illusion. And this was brought out by what we talked about with disguise and symbols. So the reason for the illusion of repetition of the same is that true repetition is always disguised. It's always hidden by symbols. And this whole section winds up by noting there are two different forms of repetition: static and dynamic repetition. And the example that Deleuze gave us of dynamic repetition is learning to swim, acquiring a motor habit. So static repetition refers back to a concept, refers back to, it's characterized, it's marked by sameness, it's superficial. He calls this bare repetition, as opposed to dynamic repetition, which is repetition of an internal difference. So the important thing here, especially regarding the acquisition of motor habits, was sign and response, not representation and action, not mere mimicry, but that deeper notion of the signal, that deeper idea of the way that we learn. And finally, we looked at Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and essentially we just said that both of them endorse Deleuze's repetition against Hegel and Kant. So against abstract mediation, against morality grounded in concepts, both endorsing this idea of repetition in that dynamic sense that Deleuze talks about it here. Alright, so I hope that helped. This video was way longer than I wanted to do it. There's no way I can make videos this length every week. I'll never do anything else with my time. But yeah, I just couldn't find a place to effectively kind of chop this in two. It was just one long exposition. So yeah, I just went with it, and this is the result. But hopefully it helped. Hopefully that clarified some things. Definitely clarified things for me. Wow, and having to redo this video was so helpful. But yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.